The morning mist clung to Elderberry Lane like a thin veil, softening the outlines of the old cottages and the gnarled oaks that lined the path. A faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves lingered in the air, a reminder that autumn had fully claimed the village. Miss Marple, ever observant, walked slowly along the cobblestones, her eyes scanning the facades of the quaint homes as if each one whispered secrets only she could hear. There was a certain rhythm to Elderberry Lane, a cadence that only someone attuned to human nature could discern, and she sensed immediately that beneath its tranquil surface, something was amiss. It began with the disappearance of Mr. Alcott, the elderly owner of the small bookshop tucked away at the far end of the lane. Though his shop was modest, it had always been a hub of quiet activity, frequented by locals who sought rare volumes or simply a friendly chat with the genial proprietor. The morning Mrs. Alcott discovered the door ajar and the bell on the counter undisturbed, she knew instinctively that something had gone terribly wrong. There was no sign of a struggle, nothing stolen, but Mr. Alcott was gone, and a subtle tension settled over the lane like a shadow that refused to lift. Miss Marple had been visiting her cousin, Mrs. Lettice Prothero, who lived in one of the larger, ivy-draped houses near the center of the village. The two women exchanged pleasantries over tea, but Miss Marple's sharp mind never rested. When Mrs. Prothero mentioned the curious news about the missing bookseller, Miss Marple's interest was piqued. There was a peculiar way Mrs. Prothero hesitated over her words, a subtle tightening around the eyes that suggested there was more to the story than she dared admit. Miss Marple noted it with silent approval. Human nature, she had always found, revealed itself in the smallest of gestures. Setting down her cup, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the bookshop herself. The walk was short, but gave her time to absorb the lane's peculiar stillness. The cottages, usually animated with the sounds of daily life, seemed unusually quiet. Curtains hung still, doors remained closed, and the usual morning chatter of neighbors exchanging greetings was conspicuously absent. Miss Marple, familiar with the patterns of village life, sensed that this silence was not ordinary. It was as though the lane itself was holding its breath, waiting for a secret to be uncovered. The bookshop door creaked under her gentle push, and the interior smelled of dust, old paper, and a faint trace of lavender, Mr. Alcott's favorite scent. Shelves lined with carefully organized volumes reached toward the low ceiling, their spines forming a mosaic of literary history. Yet amidst the order, there was a subtle disarray. A single chair was overturned, and a small stack of books lay scattered near the counter. Miss Marple's keen eyes took in every detail, noting the lack of fingerprints on the counter, the undisturbed cash box, and the way the bell had remained silent despite the apparent intrusion. She crouched to examine the books on the floor, her mind piecing together possibilities that had yet to occur to anyone else in the village. Mrs. Alcott arrived shortly thereafter, her expression a mixture of distress and quiet fear. "I don't understand," she murmured, wringing her hands. "He simply vanished. One moment he was arranging the new deliveries, and the next, gone." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying more than mere concern for her husband. Miss Marple's gaze softened but remained probing. "Tell me exactly when you last saw him," she said gently, "and what he was doing." The conversation that followed revealed a seemingly mundane routine. Mr. Alcott had been preparing a display for a visiting customer, humming softly to himself when Mrs. Alcott left to fetch the morning paper. Upon her return, the shop was as she found it now. Yet Miss Marple's intuition whispered that this mundane sequence held the key to the mystery. She spent the next hour moving through the shop, quietly examining shelves, corners, and the small storeroom in the back. Her attention was drawn to a section of the wall behind the counter, where the wallpaper had a faint discoloration, perhaps the residue of something previously attached. It was minor, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, connecting it with her recollections of local gossip and the subtle tension she had observed during her walk. A secret passage or hidden compartment was a possibility she could not ignore. For the Alcott family, though unassuming, had roots deep in the village and a history intertwined with old secrets that often went unnoticed. Outside, the day progressed, and the village began to stir as neighbors ventured out, drawn by curiosity and whispered speculation. Miss Marple, notebook in hand, took careful note of their expressions and snippets of conversation that drifted toward her on the crisp air. A butcher spoke of seeing a shadow near the lane at an unusual hour. A baker mentioned a stranger asking for directions the previous evening. Each fragment, seemingly inconsequential, formed threads that Miss Marple meticulously wove into a mental map of the unfolding puzzle. She understood that to rush would be folly. The truth, she knew, demanded patience and an almost surgical attention to detail. By midday, she had returned to Mrs. Prothero's house, the notebook tucked under her arm. Over another cup of tea, Miss Marple discussed the peculiarities she had observed. The undisturbed bell, the displaced chair, the faint marks on the wallpaper. Mrs. Prothero listened intently, her hands folded in quiet anticipation, though Miss Marple could detect a flicker of unease in her eyes. "There is a pattern here," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. "One that cannot be accidental. Every small detail points to a deliberate orchestration, something that requires careful unraveling." Her words were not merely speculation. They were the distilled product of decades spent observing human nature in its myriad forms. As afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the worn wooden floor, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Elderberry Lane, with its picturesque cottages and tranquil charm, masked layers of intrigue that only a keen mind could uncover. She felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the quiet excitement that accompanies the first real steps toward understanding a mystery. Every shadow, every gesture, every hushed word she had noted that morning contributed to the intricate web she was beginning to perceive, a web that promised revelations if one only knew where to look and how to read the subtle signs left behind. Her thoughts returned to the bookshop, to the absent Mr. Alcott, and to the silent questions that hung like mist over the lane. Who could have wanted him gone? Was it a crime of opportunity, or was there something more calculated at play? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered the possibilities. The village, so small and seemingly tranquil, had a rhythm and a set of unwritten rules that outsiders could never fully comprehend. Yet she, with her intimate understanding of human behavior and the delicate interplay of social expectation, was uniquely equipped to see the threads that others overlooked. Evening began to settle over Elderberry Lane, painting the cottages in warm amber hues. The first hints of twilight brought with them a subtle sense of foreboding, as though the day itself had grown tired of concealing its secrets. Miss Marple, undeterred, prepared to walk the lane once more, believing that a direct engagement with the environment often revealed what inquiry alone could not. Every footstep, every glance, every silent observation would contribute to a clearer picture of what had transpired. The mystery of Mr. Alcott's disappearance was only beginning to reveal itself, and Miss Marple, patient and precise, knew that each moment, each discovery, would lead her closer to the truth hidden somewhere within the quiet, secretive heart of Elderberry Lane. The sun had barely risen when Miss Marple returned to Elderberry Lane, a sense of quiet determination settling over her as the autumn chill brushed against her cheeks. The air was still, yet alive with subtle sounds, the distant clatter of a milk cart, the soft rustling of leaves, and the occasional creak of a weathered sign swinging gently in the breeze. Each note seemed amplified in the serene morning, and Miss Marple listened with the same intensity she brought to her observations of human behavior. She had a hunch that today would yield more than the casual glimpses of yesterday, that the village itself might reveal clues through its own rhythms and inconsistencies. Her first stop was the bookshop, though, She approached it now with a more analytical eye. The door, still slightly ajar, creaked as she pushed it open, and the scent of aged paper mixed with lavender greeted her. The small disturbances from the previous day, the overturned chair, the scattered books, remained almost frozen in time, yet she noticed subtle changes. A faint indentation on the carpet suggested the presence of someone taller than Mr. Alcott, someone whose shoes bore a distinct pattern of mud from the lane. She crouched, her eyes tracing the marks carefully, considering the direction they had come from and where they might lead. Her mind worked in quiet rhythm, each observation connecting seamlessly with the details she had recorded yesterday. Mrs. Alcott entered shortly afterward, her face pale but resolute, holding a small bundle of letters she had found among Mr. Alcott's possessions. I thought these might be important," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Miss Marple took the letters gently, noting the careful way they had been preserved. The handwriting was precise, almost formal, with occasional flourishes that suggested a practiced hand. As she read, she noticed a series of correspondences that hinted at business matters, minor disputes over rare volumes, and a few notes of a more personal nature. Friendly inquiries, invitations that had gone unanswered, and subtle expressions of concern from unknown correspondents. None of the letters directly indicated danger, yet Miss Marple sensed that beneath their polite veneer, tensions quietly simmered. She moved toward the counter, examining the small ledgers and order books with a discerning eye. Each page revealed a pattern of meticulous record-keeping, yet one entry caught her attention. A shipment that had arrived 2 days prior, marked as urgent, and noted with a small symbol that she did not immediately recognize. The notation was precise, almost secretive, and it suggested that someone in the village, or perhaps outside it, had taken a particular interest in this delivery. Miss Marple's mind traced the possibilities, considering the type of book, the intended recipient, and why such secrecy would be necessary. The fact that Mr. Alcott had been the only one to handle this particular transaction further narrowed the circle of potential knowledge, and she made a mental note to inquire discreetly about any unusual visitors in recent days. Stepping outside, Miss Marple felt the crisp air sharpen her thoughts. Elderberry Lane seemed quieter than ever, as though the village itself were holding its breath in anticipation of revelation. She noticed the neighbors beginning their routines, some casting curious glances toward the bookshop, others speaking in hushed tones behind drawn curtains. Every detail mattered: the angle of a gaze, the hesitation in a step, the subtle inflection of a voice. Miss Marple had long believed that ordinary people, when observed carefully, often betrayed their thoughts, in ways they themselves did not recognize. Today, she would test that theory further. She paused near the corner where the lane narrowed and glanced toward the larger houses lining the main street. One window, she observed, had recently been cleaned, a fact that suggested either meticulous housekeeping or a desire to maintain appearances for the benefit of passers-by. Another cottage displayed a new coat of paint, and the fresh scent of linseed oil lingered faintly in the air. These minor changes, seemingly trivial, could easily go unnoticed by anyone less attuned to subtle shifts in environment and routine. Yet Miss Marple considered them potential signals, indicators of personal activity that might intersect with Mr. Alcott's disappearance. Her next stop was the village post office, where the postmaster had a reputation for being observant, though slightly cantankerous. Miss Marple greeted him warmly, noting the way his eyes flickered toward the bookshop across the lane before settling on her. She asked casually about recent arrivals and departures, mentioning Mr. Alcott only in passing. The postmaster, initially guarded, soon began to speak in fragmented sentences, mentioning a visitor he had seen loitering near the lane late the previous evening, someone whose face he could not quite place but whose gait had struck him as deliberate and unusual. Miss Marple listened intently, committing the description to memory. Even such partial information could, when combined with other observations, narrow the possibilities significantly. As she walked back toward the bookshop, Miss Marple reflected on the minor inconsistencies she had noticed. The unusual shipment, the strange visitor, the subtle alterations in the village itself. Each thread, however delicate, suggested the presence of a deliberate pattern, a carefully constructed sequence that she was beginning to unravel. Her thoughts moved swiftly between people, places, and potential motives, yet she maintained a quiet patience. She knew the danger of rushing to conclusions, of allowing assumptions to fill the gaps where evidence had not yet revealed itself. Back at the bookshop, she examined the rear storeroom more closely. The space, often overlooked, contained crates of books, some newly arrived, and others awaiting cataloging. Miss Marple noted the slight scuff marks near the back wall and the faint residue of dust disturbed recently. It was as though someone had moved through the room deliberately, taking care to leave no sign beyond the barest trace. She crouched, examining the floorboards for subtle indentations, the slight unevenness where a crate had shifted. Each detail was a puzzle piece, small but essential, contributing to the emerging picture of what might have happened within these walls. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows along Elderberry Lane. Miss Marple paused near the small village green, noting the movements of the few children playing there. The steady rhythm of a clock tower chiming in the distance, and the occasional passer-by casting inquisitive glances toward the bookshop. Every element formed a tapestry, each thread of observation weaving seamlessly into the next. She sensed that the day's discoveries were only the beginning, that the mystery's full complexity would soon demand a more deliberate engagement. Her thoughts returned to Mr. Alcott, to the letters, to the shipment, and to the subtle marks she had found throughout the shop. Each detail hinted at the presence of unseen forces, motives hidden behind polite expressions and seemingly mundane routines. Miss Marple understood that unraveling this mystery would require not only careful observation, but also a deep comprehension of human nature, the quiet manipulations and secret ambitions that often lay beneath the surface of village life. She felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the precise combination of caution and curiosity that always guided her investigations. As twilight descended, softening the edges of Elderberry Lane and bathing the cottages in muted gold, Miss Marple resolved to follow the emerging threads with patience and precision. Each observation, each fragment of information, would contribute to a growing map of the mystery, a map that, if read correctly, would reveal the truth behind Mr. Alcott's disappearance. The lane, serene yet quietly insistent, seemed to offer its secrets in measured increments, and Miss Marple, ever vigilant, knew that her next steps would be crucial. With careful attention, steady reasoning, and an unerring understanding of human nature, she would begin to untangle the web woven so subtly around Elderberry Lane, and in doing so, draw closer to the answers that had eluded the village for so long. Miss Marple spent the early morning walking slowly along Elderberry Lane, her senses alert to the faintest disturbances in the village's rhythm. The air had turned colder overnight, a crispness that made the fallen leaves rustle sharply underfoot. Shops were beginning to open, the baker's oven smoke curling lazily into the sky, and yet there was a subtle tension in the quiet movements of the villagers. Faces turned her way with fleeting curiosity, eyes narrowing slightly, as if instinctively aware that something had shifted in the ordinary flow of their lives. Miss Marple, attuned to such subtleties, understood that these small reactions were fragments of information, each capable of guiding her closer to the heart of the mystery. She returned to the bookshop, where the door now stood firmly closed but never locked, a habit of Mr. Alcott's that had always struck her as practical yet oddly casual. Inside, the room retained the same faint scent of old paper and lavender, but her attention was immediately drawn to the ledger on the counter. She ran her fingers lightly across the pages, noting the neat columns of numbers, the careful annotations, and the unusual symbols that marked certain entries. Yesterday, she had only glimpsed them. Today, she studied them with a deliberate focus. The urgent shipment, she realized, was not just a simple delivery. The manner in which it had been logged, the small flourish next to it, suggested the involvement of someone meticulous, someone accustomed to secrecy. Her mind traced the possibilities, considering vendors, competitors, and any outsiders who might take an interest in rare books of the sort Mr. Alcott handled. Mrs. Alcott appeared again, holding a small bundle of notes that had arrived for her husband over the past week. "I thought perhaps these might give you some clue," she said hesitantly, her eyes betraying a mixture of worry and hope. Miss Marple accepted them, carefully sorting the correspondence into stacks, observing handwriting, tone, and even the type of paper used. A few notes were unsigned, their content brief and unremarkable, yet the underlying urgency, the clipped phrasing, hinted at pressure being applied. Subtle, yet firm. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on these, recognizing that in their simplicity lay potential threads to be unraveled. The very ordinary nature of the notes made them easy to overlook, but she had learned long ago that ordinary often concealed the extraordinary in matters of human intrigue. Her attention was drawn to the shop's rear window, through which the faint shapes of neighboring cottages could be discerned. Miss Marple stood quietly, noting who appeared in the distance, the angles of shutters, and the seemingly incidental movements of the residents. One window, on the second floor of a nearby house, had been opened slightly, though the room itself was dark and quiet. Such a small detail might seem inconsequential, but her intuition insisted it was connected, however indirectly, to the currents running beneath the surface of the lane. People, she knew, left traces of themselves everywhere. A shadow on a wall, a whisper in the air, the faint impression of a footstep on a threshold. Her musings were interrupted by a sudden knock at the shop door. Startled, Mrs. Alcott hastened to open it, revealing a young man, neatly dressed, yet carrying an air of unease. I hope I'm not disturbing anyone," he said quickly. "I'm looking for Mr. Alcott. My name is Harold Finch. I've come about a rare book he was expecting to receive." Miss Marple observed him carefully, noting the tension in his hands, the rapidity of his speech, the slight forward lean that suggested eagerness bordering on desperation. Every gesture, however small, revealed more than the words themselves. She nodded politely, allowing him to continue speaking while her mind catalogued his movements. Finch mentioned a recently published manuscript, one that Mr. Alcott had been trying to acquire for months. He spoke of it with a precision and fervor that seemed unusual, almost obsessive. Miss Marple asked a few innocuous questions, careful to note his reactions. The young man shifted frequently, eyes darting toward the shelves, as though expecting someone to appear from the shadows at any moment. When she inquired whether he had spoken to anyone else in the village about the book, his response was hesitant, evasive even, a slight tightening of the lips betraying reluctance to be fully forthcoming. Miss Marple, ever patient, filed these small discrepancies away. They would, in time, reveal the true shape of his involvement. Later, she decided to retrace Mr. Alcott's last known steps, beginning with the narrow cobbled path behind the shop. The lane here narrowed further, lined with high hedges that created pockets of shadow even in full daylight. Miss Marple's eyes scanned carefully for traces, disturbances in the leaves, unusual footprints, or the faint impression of something recently moved. She found the faintest scuff near a hidden drainage grate, a detail most would have dismissed entirely. She crouched, examining it from several angles, measuring the depth and orientation. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. Something heavy had been dragged here, deliberately concealed, yet leaving just enough evidence for someone with patience and insight to detect. Her thoughts wandered to the neighbors, to the fragments of conversation she had overheard, to the hints of anxiety in the villagers' faces. Each person she had spoken to seemed to provide pieces that did not yet form a coherent picture, but Miss Marple understood that the mosaic was gradually assembling itself. The missing bookseller, the cryptic shipment, the young man's anxious visit, and the faint traces at the back of the lane were all threads, separate yet intertwined, converging toward a design that required careful, deliberate attention to unravel. By mid-afternoon, the village had begun to stir more noticeably. The baker's bell clanged repeatedly, children's laughter echoed faintly, and the distant clip-clop of a horse-drawn cart suggested the rhythm of ordinary life continuing on its familiar course. Yet Miss Marple observed the contrasts, the villagers' glances toward the bookshop, the half-finished tasks abandoned momentarily in curiosity, and the low murmurs exchanged over hedgerows. Each fragment, each pause, contributed to her growing understanding. She walked among them, asking subtle, seemingly casual questions, watching reactions, gauging the interplay of honesty and hesitation. Returning to the shop in the late afternoon, Miss Marple paused to consider the layout once more. The rear storeroom, the narrow aisle between shelves, the counter itself, all offered angles for observation, concealment, and subtle movement. She considered the possibility of hidden compartments, secret spaces within the familiar, the ordinary facades that often masked extraordinary actions. Every detail was a potential key. A small mark on the floor, an unusually polished surface, the faint aroma of a substance out of place. The world, she knew, spoke to those willing to listen, and Elderberry Lane was speaking now in whispers, just perceptible to a careful ear. As evening approached, the fading light cast long shadows along the lane, elongating the cottages and darkening the corners where subtle activity might have occurred. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the precise balance of patience and inquiry that guided her investigations. The threads she had gathered today, seemingly disparate, were beginning to intertwine, forming patterns that only she could discern. The missing bookseller's fate, the mysterious shipment, and the unusual visitor were all part of a web she was unraveling slowly, each discovery building upon the last. Walking home under the dimming sky, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to drift over the day's observations. Every gesture, every small irregularity, every hint of tension mattered. She sensed that the critical moment of revelation was approaching, though its precise shape remained elusive. Yet she was confident in her method, in her meticulous attention to detail, and in the subtle understanding of human behavior that had guided her for decades. Elderberry Lane, in all its quiet charm and hidden tensions, was revealing its secrets incrementally, and she, patient and vigilant, would follow each clue until the full truth emerged in all its complexity and consequence. Miss Marple awoke to a sky painted with the soft, diffused light of early morning, the mist curling lazily along Elderberry Lane and clinging to the eaves of the cottages. A faint chill lingered in the air, the kind that made one draw a shawl tighter across the shoulders, but she welcomed it, sensing that the clarity of thought it brought was as valuable as any lamp or magnifying glass. Today, she intended to pursue the threads that had emerged over the previous days, focusing especially on the subtle inconsistencies and unnoticed behaviors that often held the key to understanding. The village, serene as it seemed, had a rhythm, and she was determined to follow it meticulously, step by step. Her first stop was the Alcott residence, where Mrs. Alcott awaited with a quiet mixture of hope and anxiety. The widow had spent the night poring over her husband's letters and ledgers, finding herself increasingly bewildered by their seemingly ordinary content. Miss Marple greeted her gently and asked to review the notes again. Together, they spread the papers across the dining table, observing the nuances of each entry, the careful ink strokes, the variance in handwriting, the small symbols that appeared in certain margins. These symbols, Miss Marple noted, were not random. They suggested a code of sorts, perhaps a system of marking particular books or correspondence for special attention. The idea that someone outside the village had taken an interest in Mr. Alcott's acquisitions seemed increasingly plausible, and Miss Marple considered the possibility that this interest had grown urgent, enough to provoke his sudden disappearance. After a quiet breakfast, she decided to retrace the last known errands of Mr. Alcott, beginning with the cobbled street near the post office. Her eyes scanned every detail, the patterns of mud left by carts, the subtle wear on the stone steps, and the minute impressions in the dust along window sills. Even the most ordinary marks held potential significance. She paused outside the small grocer's shop, noting a delivery crate that had shifted overnight. The wood bore faint scratches that hinted at handling by someone unfamiliar with its weight and balance, a clue Miss Marple filed carefully in her mental ledger. She understood that such traces, seemingly minor, could connect to the larger puzzle, indicating the movement of objects or people at precise times. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made her way back to the bookshop. The young man, Harold Finch, had returned, this time with a polite note of apology for disturbing the household. He claimed to have information about the manuscript Mr. Alcott had been expecting, though his hesitance in speaking suggested that he was withholding more than he revealed. Miss Marple invited him to sit, observing his posture, the rapid blinking, the slight tremor in his fingers. "You seem concerned about something more than the book itself," she said softly, her tone gentle but insistent. Finch's hesitation confirmed her intuition. He shifted uncomfortably, glanced toward the back of the shop as though fearing someone's sudden appearance, and finally murmured, "There were others. Others who knew it was coming. I didn't expect them to act so quickly." Miss Marple listened with deliberate patience, letting the words settle, analyzing the cadence and weight of each phrase. Finch admitted that he had overheard rumors of someone outside the village who had taken an unusual interest in rare manuscripts, and that Mr. Alcott had been correspondingly careful, noting contacts and visitors in private notebooks that he had not yet disclosed to anyone. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting this confession with the urgent shipment, the faint marks at the back of the shop, and the signs of anxiety she had noticed in the villagers over the past days. Each detail interlocked, forming a network of possibilities that pointed toward deliberate interference with Mr. Alcott's affairs. She decided it was time to examine the immediate surroundings of the bookshop more closely. Moving into the rear alley, Miss Marple observed the walls, the cobbled path, and the foliage that crept along the stone fences. A fresh disturbance in the leaves caught her attention. A small indentation, the depth and angle suggesting that someone had knelt here or crouched to manipulate an object hidden from casual view. Near it lay a fragment of paper, torn hastily, with partial letters forming no coherent word, but clearly part of a message that had been dropped. She collected it, carefully, knowing that even this small remnant could provide a critical insight when examined alongside other evidence. As she continued, Miss Marple noticed the window of a neighboring cottage slightly ajar. Peering discreetly, she discerned the faint outline of a figure moving within. Though she could not see clearly, the deliberate, careful movements suggested someone searching, perhaps in response to the same pressures and urgencies that had led to Mr. Alcott's disappearance. Miss Marple recorded this observation mentally, understanding that patterns of movement within the village were as telling as the static clues left behind. She had long believed that human behavior, repeated or concealed, often left subtle marks for those attuned to see them, and today the village seemed to offer these marks willingly. Her path next took her to the small village green, where a few residents had gathered, speaking in hushed tones. Children played quietly nearby, their laughter a sharp contrast to the adults' whispered speculations. Miss Marple approached the group, engaging in casual conversation, all the while noting gestures, changes in expression, and fleeting glances toward the bookshop. One man, the local carpenter, mentioned seeing an unfamiliar figure near the lane late the previous evening, moving with purposeful, cautious steps. Another, the schoolmistress, recalled overhearing a snippet of conversation that hinted at disagreement among collectors about the arrival of a particular manuscript. Miss Marple absorbed each fragment with calm precision, storing the information in a framework that would allow her to connect the scattered dots with clarity. By late morning, the mist had lifted, leaving a pale, cold light that revealed every detail in sharper contrast. Miss Marple returned to the bookshop, examining the ledger and letters anew. Finch had departed, but his presence lingered in the impressions he left. The subtle anxiety in the air, the disturbance of the floor near the counter, and the faint scent of his aftershave mingling with the lingering lavender. These small, almost imperceptible cues spoke volumes, and Miss Marple considered them alongside the other signs. The torn fragment of paper, the marks in the alley, the odd behaviors of the villagers. She could sense the contours of a narrative forming, one that demanded careful attention to timing, sequence, and motive. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Prothero later in the afternoon, knowing that a broader understanding of village dynamics could illuminate hidden connections. Elderberry Lane, though small and seemingly insular, had patterns of interaction and subtle influence that shaped behavior in ways outsiders rarely recognized. Miss Marple walked slowly, observing, questioning silently, and letting her mind assemble a coherent picture from fragments that might otherwise appear unrelated. Every step, every glance, every gesture contributed to the emergent clarity she sought. As the day progressed toward evening, Miss Marple paused on a quiet stretch of the lane, the warm light softening the edges of the cottages and casting long shadows. She reviewed the accumulated evidence in her mind. The unusual shipment, the anxious visitor, the mysterious fragments and disturbances, and the villagers' subtle reactions. Each element pointed toward a carefully orchestrated interference, deliberate and calculated, yet executed with a subtlety that allowed it to blend almost seamlessly into ordinary life. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, knowing that the next stage of inquiry would demand both patience and shrewd engagement. The threads were converging, the tapestry of the mystery growing ever more intricate, and she was prepared to follow them wherever they might lead, with the quiet, unwavering determination that had long defined her investigations. The morning air on Elderberry Lane was sharp, carrying with it the faint tang of frost from the previous night. Miss Marple walked slowly, deliberately, taking note of every sound and movement that might betray more than the ordinary rhythm of the village. The stillness was deceptive, as if the lane itself had been holding its breath, waiting for a new disturbance to reveal the undercurrent of tension that had taken root since Mr. Alcott's disappearance. She felt a quiet sense of anticipation, knowing that each subtle clue collected in the past days was beginning to converge, forming a pattern that demanded careful attention. Her first stop was the Alcott residence, where Mrs. Alcott greeted her with a weary, anxious smile. The widow had spent the night reviewing every note, letter, and ledger entry with renewed determination, yet her frustration and worry were palpable. "I can't make sense of it," she said softly, her hands fidgeting with a corner of a letter. "Everything seems ordinary, yet I know something has happened. Something deliberate." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, taking the papers and arranging them once more on the dining table. She examined the annotations and symbols, noting how certain entries appeared more heavily marked, the ink darker or pressed harder, as if the writer had emphasized them intentionally. These subtle variations, she knew, could indicate the items or correspondence of greatest importance, offering insight into what had provoked Mr. Alcott's disappearance. After a brief discussion with Mrs. Alcott, Miss Marple set out for the bookshop, where the air remained faintly scented with lavender and aged paper. She moved slowly through the narrow aisles, her eyes scanning for details overlooked in previous inspections. Her attention was drawn to the corner near the rear shelves, where the floorboards bore faint impressions that suggested the movement of a heavy object. Kneeling to inspect them, she noticed small flecks of a darker substance, perhaps soil or ink, that had been transferred inadvertently. Miss Marple's mind considered the possibilities: the movement of crates, a hidden compartment accessed, or a hurried concealment. Each trace, while subtle, hinted at deliberate action. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Harold Finch appeared again, this time with a more urgent expression, carrying a slim package wrapped in plain brown paper. "I found this among Mr. Alcott's things," he said quickly, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I think it may be related to the shipment he was expecting." Miss Marple accepted the package, noting the careful folds and the neat tape sealing it. She felt the familiar spark of anticipation. This could be the first tangible piece of evidence that might clarify the shadowy threads she had been following. Finch lingered, fidgeting, clearly anxious to leave, yet reluctant to depart without providing information he feared might be overlooked. Inside the package, she found a small, leather-bound volume, its cover worn but intact, along with a folded letter written in a hurried hand. The letter contained a few cryptic sentences mentioning a previous owner of the book and a promised meeting that had apparently been disrupted. The handwriting suggested urgency. The phrasing implied caution, and the tone hinted at a hidden significance that was not immediately apparent. Miss Marple studied both the book and the letter carefully, noting the subtle signs of handling, the faint smudges on the corners, and the carefully preserved edges. She understood that the item had been transported or handled by someone aware of its importance, and likely by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Once Finch had left, Miss Marple took the parcel to the rear alley, examining the surroundings anew. The faint impressions she'd noticed the previous day were now more significant in context. A small indentation in the frost suggested recent passage, and the angle of sunlight revealed minute disturbances in the leaves that had gone unnoticed before. She crouched to inspect them, mentally reconstructing the likely sequence of movements, the weight of the package, and the care with which it had been handled. Each observation reinforced the idea that Mr. Alcott's disappearance was not random, that it was the result of a carefully orchestrated plan executed with precision and knowledge of his habits. By mid-morning, she returned to the village green, where the residents were gradually becoming more active, performing their daily routines with a cautious awareness of the events surrounding the bookshop. Miss Marple paused among them, listening to casual conversations, noting gestures, inflections, and fleeting expressions of unease. The baker mentioned seeing an unusual figure slipping between the hedges near the lane late the previous evening. A group of school children, under the watchful eye of their governess, spoke in whispers of a stranger who had arrived briefly to inquire about the Alcott shop. Each fragment, minor though it seemed, was catalogued with precision, forming part of the emerging framework that Miss Marple was carefully constructing. Her next destination was the small post office, where the postmaster had been unusually talkative since the events began. He mentioned deliveries that had been redirected, letters that had arrived without proper identification, and a certain collector who had asked questions about rare books in a manner that suggested more than ordinary curiosity. Miss Marple probed lightly, noting the emphasis he placed on certain words and the hesitation in his voice when discussing specific visitors. These clues, seemingly scattered, began to fit into a pattern she was gradually discerning. Someone had an interest in Mr. Alcott's rare acquisitions and was willing to act surreptitiously to obtain them, manipulating events to remove obstacles in their path. Returning to the bookshop, Miss Marple examined the ledger and letters again, cross-referencing the new insights from her village inquiries with the entries she had studied earlier. She noted that certain correspondences had been carefully hidden, not merely misplaced, suggesting a deliberate effort to control information. The urgency noted in some entries, the cryptic symbols, and the careful handling of specific items all pointed to an organized interest in the rare manuscripts Mr. Alcott was collecting. Miss Marple realized that whoever was behind this had been observing the bookseller closely, anticipating his movements, and likely influencing the village environment in subtle ways to facilitate their plans. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows along Elderberry Lane, Miss Marple made a final inspection of the shop's rear storeroom. The crates and stacks of books, previously noted for their slight disturbances, were now of greater significance. Small scratches and faint smudges suggested repeated handling, as though someone had been searching systematically. She examined the floorboards, the corners, and the slight dust displacement, mentally reconstructing how a visitor might have navigated the space, what they sought, and how they avoided leaving more obvious traces. It was becoming increasingly clear that Mr. Alcott had been dealing with a clever and methodical individual, someone capable of both patience and precision. By evening, the village had settled into its customary quiet, yet the undercurrent of tension remained palpable. Miss Marple paused on the lane, reflecting on the day's observations and the intricate connections that were emerging. The unusual shipment, the anxious visitor, the cryptic letters, and the subtle signs of movement throughout the bookshop all converged into a coherent picture, a calculated interference with Mr. Alcott's affairs, executed with care and foresight. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the awareness that the mystery was beginning to reveal itself in fragments that, when assembled, would illuminate the orchestrated sequence behind the disappearance. She understood that patience, careful observation, and the study of human nature would be essential in uncovering the full truth, and she welcomed the challenge with the steady resolve that had guided her through countless enigmas in the past. The morning on Elderberry Lane arrived with a pale, silvery light, the kind that cast even the familiar cottages in a slightly unfamiliar hue. Mist lingered in pockets along the lane, curling around the bases of hedges and the worn cobblestones in a manner that lent the village an almost otherworldly quiet. Miss Marple walked with measured steps, her eyes sweeping the lane, her mind piecing together the sequences of events that had begun to form a pattern in her memory. Each morning seemed to unveil a new layer of subtlety, a shift in behavior or atmosphere that could offer insight into Mr. Alcott's disappearance. She sensed that the day ahead might be pivotal in connecting the threads she had gathered, and she welcomed the challenge. Her first stop was the bookshop, which had become the central focus of the villagers' attention. Inside, the air retained its familiar mingling of lavender and old paper, yet today there was a distinct tension, as if the shop itself was aware of its role in a larger, unfolding drama. Miss Marple moved deliberately through the aisles, her eyes scanning the arrangement of books, the slight dust displacement on the floor, and the corners where light fell unevenly. The rear storeroom, previously examined, drew her attention once again. The faint scratches and smudges she had noted before now seemed more deliberate, as if someone had been searching carefully but with repeated purpose, ensuring that their movements remained largely unnoticed. Each subtle disturbance hinted at intention, a signature of methodical behavior that spoke of patience, knowledge, and perhaps a hint of desperation. Mrs. Alcott arrived, clutching a small package of letters she had unearthed from an old cabinet. "I thought these might be connected," she said, her voice tinged with apprehension. Miss Marple accepted them, sorting through the correspondence with quiet precision. Some were simple notes from local patrons, mundane and polite, yet others bore the same cryptic symbols and emphases she had observed in previous letters. Certain passages were underlined or marked with small flourishes, a clear indication that the writer had intended to draw attention to them. Miss Marple's mind traced these markers carefully, considering the possibility that they pointed to specific books, correspondence, or incidents that were critical to understanding the unfolding mystery. The ordinary veneer of the notes, she realized, masked a deliberate attempt at communication and concealment. Her attention turned next to the ledger on the counter. The urgent shipment she had noted before remained a focal point, its annotations now taking on greater significance when compared with the newly discovered letters. Miss Marple examined the entries methodically, noting the alignment of dates, the spacing between symbols, and the repeated emphasis on particular transactions. Each nuance suggested a hierarchy of importance, revealing which items had drawn more scrutiny from Mr. Alcott or others involved. The careful balance between normal business practice and the hidden urgency embedded in the records indicated that the missing bookseller had been navigating pressures that were subtle, yet potentially dangerous. Miss Marple then retraced her steps to the rear alley, where the faint impressions in the leaves and frost had caught her attention previously. Today, under the stronger morning light, she could discern more clearly the sequence of movements left behind. The small indentations suggested someone had handled a package with care, crouching or kneeling to manipulate it, and yet avoiding more obvious signs of disturbance. Nearby, a fragment of paper remained partially hidden, the torn edge revealing only a few letters. Miss Marple examined it carefully, recognizing that even this fragment could help reconstruct the path of the individual responsible for recent events. The precision with which the traces had been left or hidden suggested a mind accustomed to observation, someone deliberate and thorough. By mid-morning, she made her way to the village green, where the residents were engaging in their routines with an undercurrent of curiosity and unease. Miss Marple observed closely, a grocer shifting crates slightly, a postman pausing to glance toward the bookshop, children whispering to one another under the watchful eye of the governess. She spoke casually with a few of the adults, noting the tension in their expressions, the subtle hesitation in their speech, and the fleeting glances toward the lane. One man mentioned seeing a shadow flit past the rear of the shop the previous evening, while another recounted hearing a muffled noise that had seemed out of place. Each piece of information, while minor in isolation, reinforced the growing pattern that Miss Marple was beginning to discern. A network of actions and reactions tied directly to the events surrounding Mr. Alcott. Returning to the shop, Miss Marple examined the letters once more, cross-referencing them with the ledger and the fragments she had found in the alley. Certain correspondences, when considered alongside the unusual shipment, suggested that someone beyond the village had a vested interest in the rare books Mr. Alcott collected. The deliberate care in handling, the urgency embedded in the annotations, and the presence of observers in the village all pointed to a coordinated effort. Miss Marple considered possible motives: financial gain, rivalry among collectors, or perhaps a desire to obtain specific knowledge contained within the manuscripts themselves. Each possibility warranted consideration, but she was careful not to jump to conclusions, knowing that the truth often revealed itself in measured increments. Later in the day, she returned to the rear storeroom for a detailed inspection. Every crate, every shelf, and every small corner was examined. Miss Marple noted minute scratches on the edges of the wooden crates, smudges that suggested repeated handling, and a slight displacement of dust along the floor. These traces indicated not only the movement of objects, but also the careful orchestration of effort intended to avoid detection. She reconstructed in her mind the likely sequence of events: a calculated search, deliberate removal or concealment of specific items, and an awareness of potential witnesses, evidenced by the careful navigation through shadows and hidden angles. As the afternoon light softened into the muted glow of early evening, Miss Marple paused outside the shop to survey the lane once more. Elderberry Lane, with its charming cottages and seemingly ordinary rhythms, had revealed small but telling irregularities: furtive glances, unexplained movements, and the faint traces of deliberate actions. Each element contributed to a growing understanding of the forces at play in Mr. Alcott's disappearance. She considered the relationships between villagers, the potential for outsiders to manipulate events, and the subtle interplay of secrecy and observation that had unfolded so quietly, yet so significantly. The fading light cast long shadows across the cobblestones, highlighting the textures of the buildings and the soft rustle of leaves in the hedges. Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation, the quiet thrill that accompanied the gathering of evidence and the careful assembly of patterns. She knew the threads of the mystery were converging, that the interplay of human behavior, deliberate action, and hidden urgency would soon reveal a coherent narrative. Patience, keen observation, and understanding of human nature would guide her in the next stages of inquiry. As she turned toward home, her mind was already piecing together possibilities, preparing for the careful unraveling of the complex web surrounding Mr. Alcott and the shadowed currents of Elderberry Lane. The morning arrived on Elderberry Lane with a subdued light filtered through the thin veil of mist that lingered between the cottages. Miss Marple moved along the cobbled path with her usual deliberate pace, her senses finely tuned to the faintest irregularities in the village's rhythm. The stillness of the early hour seemed heavier than usual, as though the lane itself was aware of the undercurrent of tension that had settled since Mr. Alcott's disappearance. Each footstep she took on the uneven stones was measured, a quiet rhythm that allowed her mind to drift over the sequence of observations she had collected, arranging them into a growing pattern. Her first stop was the bookshop, the central stage for the events that had quietly unsettled the village. Inside, the familiar scent of aged paper and lavender hung in the air, yet it carried a subtle tension, the residue of hurried movements and small disturbances she had noted in previous days. Miss Marple moved slowly through the aisles, her eyes scanning for details that might have been missed. An indentation on a shelf edge, the faint scuff of a shoe on the floorboards, the slight tilt of a crate that suggested it had been moved with care. She crouched occasionally, inspecting marks in the dust and the faint smudges of ink, each one a small but meaningful clue. The shop, in its quiet order, still bore the traces of deliberate action, subtle yet significant. Mrs. Alcott arrived shortly, carrying a small bundle of letters she had unearthed from a drawer behind the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying anxiety beneath the veneer of calm. "I thought these might help," she said softly, placing them before Miss Marple. The letters contained more than the usual mundane requests and pleasantries. Some bore urgent annotations, others cryptic symbols, and a few were hastily folded, suggesting they had been hidden or delivered in secrecy. Miss Marple studied each one meticulously, noting the ink, the paper quality, and the deliberate emphasis on certain words or phrases. These were not mere casual communications. They were carefully constructed, signaling caution, intention, and the significance of the matters they discussed. She then turned her attention to the ledger on the counter. The shipment marked urgent stood out immediately, its symbols and annotations revealing a hierarchy of importance. Miss Marple compared the letters and ledger entries, tracing patterns and connections. It became increasingly evident that someone beyond the village had taken a keen interest in Mr. Alcott's acquisitions, monitoring his activities with intent and discretion. The convergence of these signs suggested not random interference, but a calculated orchestration, and the careful handling of items implied knowledge, patience, and perhaps a subtle form of intimidation. Deciding to inspect the exterior of the shop once more, Miss Marple walked into the rear alley. The frost on the ground revealed faint impressions of someone's passage, small, deliberate, and careful. Near these marks, she discovered another fragment of paper, partially obscured beneath a clump of leaves. It bore a few letters, not enough to form words, yet enough to indicate it had been torn from a larger note, likely containing instructions or a warning. Miss Marple examined the marks in the frost, the angle of the impressions, and the distribution of the fallen leaves, mentally reconstructing the movements of the person who had handled the package or message. The meticulousness suggested a visitor who knew exactly what they were doing, who moved with caution but with a precise objective in mind. By late morning, she moved toward the village green, where the residents had begun, their routines with a subtle wariness. Miss Marple observed the glances, the hesitations, the small gestures that betrayed concern and curiosity. The grocer mentioned a stranger passing the lane in the early hours, moving with careful, deliberate steps. The schoolmistress spoke of overhearing fragments of conversation that suggested a meeting disrupted by sudden interference. Each observation, while minor on its own, began to form a clearer picture when combined with the others. The village was being subtly influenced by an external presence, someone capable of acting without drawing overt attention. Returning to the bookshop, Miss Marple reviewed the letters and ledger entries again. Cross-referencing the information, she noted the alignment between certain correspondences and specific shipment dates, as well as the careful preservation of items that seemed particularly significant. It became apparent that Mr. Alcott had been navigating not just routine business, but the pressures of deliberate surveillance. The urgency implied in the annotations, combined with the cryptic handling of communications, suggested a careful mind monitoring the shop's operations, perhaps waiting for an opportunity to act, and possibly manipulating events in the background to achieve a precise outcome. In the early afternoon, Miss Marple revisited the rear storeroom. Every crate, shelf, and corner was examined once more. She noted repeated handling, faint scratches along the edges of crates, smudges in the dust, and slight disturbances to the floorboards. The careful, systematic search suggested that someone had been looking for a particular item or document, someone who understood the layout and had anticipated the presence of observers, yet moved in a manner to minimize overt signs. Miss Marple considered the implications of this precision, the patience and knowledge required to execute such actions, and the possible motivations that might have driven them. The village itself seemed to hold its breath as evening approached. Shadows lengthened along the lane, softening the edges of the cottages while revealing subtle discrepancies in light and shade. Places where movement had recently occurred, or where someone might have lingered. Miss Marple paused outside the shop, taking in the quiet but alert demeanor of the few remaining villagers. The subtle signs she had observed over the past days, the anxious glances, the hushed conversations, and the careful handling of letters and shipments, all converged into a coherent understanding. Mr. Alcott's disappearance was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate action, executed with foresight and calculation, yet carried out with a sophistication that had left only the faintest traces behind. As twilight descended, casting the lane in muted gold and gray, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation that accompanied the gathering of sufficient information. Each observation, each subtle irregularity, each fragment of evidence formed threads that were gradually weaving a pattern she could discern. Patience and attention to detail, she knew, were essential. The intricate interplay of human behavior, deliberate interference, and hidden urgency suggested that the resolution of this mystery would demand not only careful observation, but also a profound understanding of motive and opportunity. As she turned to walk home, she reflected on the day's discoveries, sensing that the next stage of inquiry would bring the most revealing insights yet, and that the hidden mechanisms behind Mr. Alcott's disappearance were beginning to emerge from the shadows with quiet inevitability. The morning light on Elderberry Lane was crisp and clear, the kind that illuminated every corner and cast long, precise shadows across the cobblestones. Miss Marple walked with her habitual patience, her eyes scanning the familiar yet subtly shifting surroundings. The village had retained its outward calm, but beneath the surface, she could sense the invisible threads of tension that had woven themselves over the past days. Each movement of a villager, each flutter of a curtain, each faint sound carried significance, and Miss Marple noted them all with meticulous care, her mind already tracing the lines of connection between them. Her first stop was the bookshop, the locus of the mystery that had captivated both the village and her attention. Inside, the familiar scent of lavender mingled with the faint, musty aroma of old paper. Miss Marple moved quietly among the shelves, noting the slightest disturbances. A shelf slightly askew, a crate that bore a subtle scratch, a tiny smudge in the dust where someone had knelt. The rear storeroom, always a place of particular interest, revealed even more. Subtle floor impressions suggested repeated handling of objects, and the faint scent of ink lingered, distinct from the books themselves, as though a document of importance had been examined and then hastily replaced. Miss Marple catalogued these details, understanding that even the smallest irregularities could illuminate the steps of someone who had moved here deliberately, yet discreetly. Mrs. Alcott arrived, carrying with her a fresh set of letters she had found tucked away behind a loose panel in a cabinet. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the worry that had been mounting since her husband's disappearance. "I thought these might add something new," she said, placing the bundle on the counter. Miss Marple sorted the letters carefully, noting variations in handwriting, paper, and ink. Several bore cryptic symbols and emphasized passages that suggested importance beyond the literal content of the words. Others were brief, almost mundane, yet the careful choice of language indicated urgency and discretion. Miss Marple's mind traced the possibilities: coded instructions, messages intended to be intercepted, or subtle alerts about movements and intentions. Every nuance she knew had meaning. Turning her attention to the ledger, Miss Marple noted again the shipment previously marked as urgent. The notations were deliberate and precise, the symbols a clear system indicating importance or priority. Comparing the ledger with the letters, she discerned a pattern. Certain correspondences corresponded with shipment dates and annotations, suggesting a network of transactions that someone had monitored carefully. Mr. Alcott's meticulous record-keeping, while intended for his own reference, had unintentionally documented the pressures he faced from external interest. The combination of urgency, secrecy, and repeated handling indicated that whoever had taken an interest in his collection was not acting at random. Their actions were deliberate, calculated, and likely aimed at influencing or controlling access to certain items. Stepping outside, Miss Marple retraced her steps along the rear alley. The frost on the ground revealed faint impressions, subtle but telling. The pattern suggested deliberate, careful movement, the handling of a package or document, and a level of precision that indicated experience. Near the marks lay another fragment of paper, partially hidden beneath a cluster of leaves. It bore a few indistinct letters, enough to suggest it had been torn from a larger note. Miss Marple examined it closely, imagining the hand that had discarded it, the intention behind the careful yet hurried placement, and the possible message it had contained. The details reinforced a picture of calculated, precise action, and she noted the exact positioning of the impressions to reconstruct the likely path taken. By late morning, Miss Marple reached the village green, where the quiet routine of the residents was punctuated by subtle signs of unease. The grocer mentioned seeing a stranger pass along the lane in the early hours, moving deliberately but cautiously. The postman spoke of letters that had been redirected without explanation, a deviation from his otherwise orderly delivery. Miss Marple noted the interplay of their statements, the hesitations, and the glances toward the bookshop, all of which hinted at shared knowledge or collective uncertainty. Each fragment, however small, contributed to a broader understanding. Someone outside the village had orchestrated events in a manner that influenced both Mr. Alcott and the villagers, moving strategically while maintaining the appearance of ordinary life. Returning to the shop, she examined the letters and ledger once more. Cross-referencing dates, annotations, and correspondences, Miss Marple began to see an underlying structure, a deliberate effort to guide or manipulate Mr. Alcott's actions without overt intervention. The urgency implied in certain entries, combined with the careful handling and preservation of items, indicated a methodical, patient approach designed to achieve a specific outcome. She considered possible motives: acquisition of valuable manuscripts, rivalry among collectors, or strategic manipulation for personal gain. Each scenario aligned with the meticulous patterns she observed, yet she withheld judgment, preferring to gather further corroboration. In the early afternoon, she returned to the rear storeroom. Every crate, shelf, and corner was carefully inspected. Minor scratches, dust displacement, and smudges revealed repeated, deliberate handling. Miss Marple reconstructed the likely movements, crouching to examine a package, adjusting crates to access hidden items, avoiding obvious traces while leaving subtle signs of their passage. The level of precision suggested knowledge and experience, an understanding of both the shop's layout and the patterns of observation that Mr. Alcott and the villagers might unwittingly maintain. This visitor, she realized, had operated with patience and calculated purpose, capable of manipulating circumstances while remaining almost invisible. As evening approached, the village's ordinary rhythms resumed, but with a subtle tension lingering in the air. Shadows lengthened across the lane, and faint sounds, the click of a distant gate, the rustle of leaves in the hedges, reminded Miss Marple that movement had occurred even in apparent stillness. She paused outside the bookshop, absorbing the accumulated evidence, the cryptic letters, the careful ledger annotations, the impressions and fragments in the alley, and the villagers' wary reactions. All pointed toward a coordinated effort, deliberate and informed, to influence events surrounding Mr. Alcott. Miss Marple felt the familiar, quiet thrill of anticipation. Each observation, every subtle irregularity, every carefully concealed detail formed threads that were beginning to interweave into a coherent pattern. She understood that the resolution of the mystery required not only the identification of physical traces, but also insight into motive, opportunity, and human nature. As she turned toward home under the muted glow of the early evening sky, she reflected on the day's findings, confident that the next stage of inquiry would bring the most revealing insights yet. Elderberry Lane, with all its charm and subtle intricacies, was gradually exposing the hidden mechanisms behind Mr. Alcott's disappearance, and Miss Marple was poised to follow them with patience, precision, and unwavering attention. The morning mist hung low over Elderberry Lane, wrapping the cottages in a soft, muted haze that seemed to muffle the usual sounds of the village. Miss Marple walked slowly, her gaze attentive to every detail along the familiar cobbled streets, knowing that even the smallest observation could provide the key to unraveling the ongoing mystery. The quiet tension that had settled over the lane since Mr. Alcott's disappearance was palpable. The villagers moved with subtle caution, glancing toward the bookshop with faint curiosity and concern. Every gesture, every hesitation was a clue to the intricate web she had been patiently untangling. Her first stop, as always, was the bookshop. The door opened with its familiar creak, and she stepped inside, inhaling the combined scents of lavender and old paper that had become so familiar. Miss Marple moved deliberately through the aisles, noting the smallest irregularities. A slightly tilted shelf, the faint smudge on a corner of a book, a dusted floorboard that bore the impressions of careful footsteps. The rear storeroom drew her attention immediately. The faint scratches along the floorboards and the subtle displacement of crates suggested repeated handling, deliberate and precise. She crouched to examine the marks more closely, visualizing the movements of whoever had traversed the space, handling objects with knowledge and care, leaving only minimal traces for those observing. Mrs. Alcott arrived shortly, carrying with her a small bundle of letters she had discovered hidden behind a loose panel. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the counter. "I found these among my husband's things," she said softly. Miss Marple accepted them, sorting through the correspondence with measured attention. Some letters were ordinary, polite notes, yet others contained cryptic symbols, underlined phrases, or emphases that suggested urgency and secrecy. Miss Marple observed the variations in handwriting, the subtle differences in paper, and the slight smudges that hinted at hurried handling. Each detail added to her understanding of the pressures Mr. Alcott had been under and the deliberate nature of the outside interest that had been exerted upon him. She then turned to the ledger on the counter. The shipment, previously marked as urgent, caught her eye once more. The annotations, symbols, and careful spacing indicated a hierarchy of importance, with certain items or correspondence singled out for special attention. Comparing the ledger entries with the letters she had just examined, Miss Marple began to trace a pattern of interaction between Mr. Alcott and outside parties. The urgency, secrecy, and repeated handling suggested that a deliberate observer had been monitoring these transactions, calculating their movements, and potentially manipulating events to achieve a specific end. After examining the ledger, Miss Marple moved to the rear alley. The frost on the ground had melted slightly in the morning light, but faint impressions remained. They revealed subtle, deliberate movements. Someone had crouched to handle a package or document, carefully avoiding obvious traces while leaving minor signs that could be pieced together by a keen observer. She found another fragment of paper partially hidden among the leaves. The letters were insufficient to form words, yet they suggested a torn message, discarded or lost in haste. Miss Marple studied the marks in the soil and the placement of the fragment, reconstructing the likely sequence of actions and noting the careful precision of the individual involved. By mid-morning, she walked toward the village green, observing the residents as they went about their daily routines. There was a quiet tension in the air. Villagers exchanged brief glances, paused mid-conversation, and avoided lingering too long in one place. Miss Marple approached a few residents casually, listening to their observations without drawing attention. One man mentioned seeing a stranger moving deliberately along the lane in the early hours. The grocer noted that several deliveries had been redirected unusually. The schoolmistress recalled fragments of a conversation she'd overheard, suggesting someone's interest in the shop's affairs. Each observation, though small in isolation, contributed to the emerging pattern. Coordinated surveillance, careful intervention, and deliberate manipulation of circumstances surrounding Mr. Alcott. Returning to the bookshop, Miss Marple cross-referenced the ledger entries with the letters and her observations from the alley and the village green. The alignment of dates, annotations, and correspondences revealed a methodical approach. Someone was monitoring Mr. Alcott's acquisitions with precision, orchestrating events in a way that influenced his actions without overt interference. The deliberate urgency, careful handling of letters and packages, and the subtle presence of observers indicated that this was not a random intrusion, but a coordinated effort aimed at obtaining something specific, whether a manuscript, knowledge, or influence over Mr. Alcott himself. In the early afternoon, Miss Marple revisited the storeroom for a detailed inspection. She examined crates, shelves, and corners with scrutiny, noting the repeated handling indicated by small scratches, smudges, and slight dust disturbances. The precision with which objects had been moved suggested familiarity with the shop's layout, awareness of observation, and a methodical approach to the search. Miss Marple reconstructed the likely sequence of movements, the handling of particular items, and the careful steps taken to minimize evidence while still achieving an objective. It was clear that the individual responsible was both patient and skilled, operating with knowledge and intent. As evening approached, Elderberry Lane settled into its quieter rhythm, yet the tension lingered in the air like an unspoken current. Shadows stretched along the cobblestones, highlighting subtle irregularities and movements that might have been missed in brighter light. Miss Marple paused outside the shop, surveying the lane and reflecting on the collected observations. Cryptic letters, ledger entries, impressions in the alley, and the villagers' wary glances. They all converged into a coherent picture, a calculated, deliberate interference in Mr. Alcott's affairs, carried out with sophistication and foresight. Miss Marple felt the familiar, quiet thrill of anticipation, the realization that the clues were coalescing into a structure she could now perceive with clarity. Each small detail, the careful handling, the hidden messages, the measured movements, was a thread in the intricate tapestry of this mystery. She understood that the next stage would demand careful reasoning, insight into human behavior, and the patience to connect motive, opportunity, and method. As she walked toward her home under the soft glow of evening, she sensed the final pieces were beginning to fall into place, and that the resolution of the mystery surrounding Mr. Alcott and Elderberry Lane was drawing ever nearer. The morning on Elderberry Lane was unusually bright, the crisp sunlight dissolving the lingering mist and illuminating the cottages with an almost harsh clarity. Miss Marple walked at her usual deliberate pace, absorbing every detail along the familiar cobbled streets. The angles of shadows, the subtle impressions in the frost, the way the village seemed to hold itself in a quiet, expectant tension. Today, she sensed, would provide the final pieces needed to unravel the carefully woven mystery surrounding Mr. Alcott's disappearance. Every observation collected over the past days was now ready to converge into a single, coherent narrative. Her first stop was the Alcott residence, where Mrs. Alcott met her at the door, eyes wide with apprehension. I haven't slept well, Miss Marple," she admitted, wringing her hands. "Every time I think I understand what has happened, something new confuses me." Miss Marple nodded with gentle reassurance. "Patience, my dear. Sometimes the truth takes its time, but it will appear, if we follow it carefully." They sat at the dining table, where the letters, ledger, and fragments collected over the preceding days lay spread before them. Miss Marple examined each once more, noticing patterns that had not been obvious at first glance, the consistent emphasis on certain symbols, the repeated attention to particular dates, and the careful handling of specific manuscripts. Each clue reinforced her growing conviction. The disappearance was deliberate, orchestrated by someone who understood both Mr. Alcott and the subtle rhythms of the village. Miss Marple decided it was time to speak with Harold Finch one last time. She found him at the bookshop, nervously arranging the newly arrived shipments of rare books. "I hope you don't mind my returning," he said, hesitating. I have more information." Miss Marple invited him to sit and speak freely. Finch explained that a local collector, Mr. Wren, had been unusually insistent on acquiring a certain rare manuscript Mr. Alcott had recently purchased. He described how Wren had visited the village multiple times under the pretense of casual inquiry, leaving subtle indications that he knew the exact timing of shipments and the layout of the shop. Finch admitted he had been intimidated by Wren's determination and subtle threats, which explained the secrecy and hurried handling of certain letters and packages. With Finch's testimony, Miss Marple could see the final picture forming. She requested that Finch guide her to Mr. Wren's temporary residence on the outskirts of the village. As they approached, Miss Marple observed the careful positioning of crates and parcels outside the house, the slightly disturbed soil near the side entrance, and the faint scent of ink and old paper that drifted on the morning air. These were the traces she had been anticipating, the physical manifestations of deliberate intervention. Miss Marple noted the precise arrangement, recognizing it as the culmination of the pattern she had been reconstructing over days. Meticulous observation, deliberate concealment, and the manipulation of ordinary village routines to achieve a singular objective. Entering the house, Miss Marple found it quiet but orderly, the rooms filled with shelves of rare books and manuscripts. She moved methodically, observing subtle signs of recent activity, a displaced chair near a desk, an ink-stained blotter with letters partially unfolded, and small indentations on the floor suggesting someone had recently knelt or crouched. Then, in a hidden compartment behind a shelf, she discovered Mr. Alcott himself, unharmed but clearly exhausted. "I thought I could hide safely until the arrangements were made," he admitted softly. "I underestimated how determined they would be." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and discerning, had anticipated this exact scenario. Mr. Alcott had not been taken by force, but had chosen temporary concealment in response to the subtle pressure applied by Wren, who had sought to acquire the manuscript without confrontation. The confrontation with Mr. Wren was calm, but decisive. Miss Marple presented the pattern of his movements, the deliberate handling of letters and shipments, and the subtle influence exerted over the villagers, each point meticulously outlined. Wren's initial arrogance faltered under the clarity of her deductions. He admitted to his calculated efforts, revealing a mixture of greed and obsession for the rare manuscripts he coveted. "I never meant for anyone to be harmed," he said defensively, yet his carefully constructed alibis and subtle manipulations betrayed the reality of his actions. Miss Marple's keen observation and patient collection of evidence had dismantled his strategy without a single unnecessary accusation, revealing the truth with elegant precision. Returning to Elderberry Lane with Mr. Alcott, Miss Marple noted the subtle relief that rippled through the village. Residents watched from a respectful distance as the bookshop's owner returned safely, the tension that had lingered for days giving way to quiet smiles and relieved murmurs. Conversations resumed, this time infused with cautious cheer rather than anxious speculation. Miss Marple spoke briefly with Mrs. Alcott, ensuring that arrangements would be made to secure future shipments and protect sensitive manuscripts. The couple expressed profound gratitude, not only for her insight, but for her patience and discretion, which had preserved the dignity and safety of the villagers while exposing the truth. As the afternoon sun cast long, warm shadows across the lane, Miss Marple walked slowly, reflecting on the intricacies of human behavior she had observed throughout the case. Each subtle glance, each seemingly insignificant gesture, and each carefully concealed note had contributed to a larger understanding. It was not brute force or dramatic confrontation that revealed the truth, she mused, but attentive observation, patience, and a nuanced understanding of motive and opportunity. Elderberry Lane, with its quiet streets and familiar cottages, had become a stage for human ambition, fear, and curiosity, and it was through these delicate interactions that the mystery had been solved. By evening, the village had regained its customary tranquility. Windows glowed with warm light, chimneys released soft trails of smoke, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the hedges provided a comforting backdrop. Miss Marple paused at the bookshop, glancing at the carefully restored order, the crates and manuscripts safely returned to their rightful place. Her satisfaction was quiet, measured, and deeply felt. The resolution had been achieved not through confrontation alone, but through understanding, foresight, and the patient assembly of countless subtle clues. As she walked home under the softening light of dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The mystery had tested her perception, patience, and understanding of human nature. Yet it had also reinforced the fundamental truth she had always known, that even the most complex and carefully orchestrated schemes left traces, however subtle, for a discerning eye to follow. Elderberry Lane, serene once more, had returned to its peaceful rhythm, but beneath the surface, the lessons of observation, empathy, and insight lingered, reminding her that the quiet corners of the world often concealed the most intricate dramas. The final resolution was simple in its elegance. Mr. Alcott returned to his work, secure and restored to his rightful place in the village, the manuscripts he had sought to protect safe once more. Mr. Wren faced the consequences of his ambitions, not through public scandal, but through the quiet, certain accountability that Miss Marple's observations ensured. And Miss Marple herself walked back to her home with the calm satisfaction of a case fully understood, the intricate puzzle of human behavior and hidden motives revealed with her characteristic clarity. In the soft glow of the evening, Elderberry Lane lay serene, the mystery resolved, its lessons quietly etched into the rhythms of village life and the patient mind of one of its most perceptive inhabitants.